Okay, we're back from our break, and we're going to go on and look at the events that happened between the Second and Third Crusades, and then we'll go on to look at the Third Crusade. And at the end, I want to bring up some questions of interpretation about the Crusades as a whole, both the Crusades as a concept and the Crusades as a movement, as Jonathan Riley Smith calls it. So we'll look at this information with that in mind, that we're going to discuss some of these events at the end and some of the concepts about interpreting the Crusades. And this will prepare us for our final exam, because the final exam is going to have some questions on, how do we think about the Crusades as a concept, as an entire group of events that fit together in some way? How do we interpret them? How do we conceptualize them? And so we'll sort of end with that. Okay, between the Second and Third Crusades, after the failure of the Second Crusade in the East, the Crusaders were mostly on the defensive. Now they had stopped conquering, and this marked the time when they were not going to be conquering new lands anymore, but defending what they already had, and their castles became essential for their survival. I was not able to bring you a map that would show all of the castles, because my map was not big enough to put all those little dots on them, but I mean, it would make it all black all over. I mean, there were hundreds of castles constructed throughout the entire Holy Land, all of the Crusader states. They were everywhere. They were about a day's journey apart, and they were just constantly there. Stephen, have you actually been back to Lebanon and Syria and that area? Oh, okay, because you could probably tell us how close together they are. Don't forget to press your mic. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going until next year. My mom could probably tell you easily, but I don't know.
Yeah, but when I have pictures and have seen movies like travelogues of that entire area, Syria and Lebanon and Palestine, and it's just filled with castles. They're everywhere. And the best castles that survive in the world today, the best medieval castles, are in the Holy Land, because the ones in Europe have been refined and added to and built onto and renovated, and some of them are just ruined by their renovations. And so, I mean, real functioning castles survive in the Holy Land. I'll show you a couple of pictures of them. So the castles became very essential as defensive points, so that you could actually defend the entire countryside. And castles were built on mountaintops. They were built on islands. They were everywhere. They were just everywhere in all of the Christian Crusader states. From the time of the defeat of the Second Crusade onward, the Muslim advance continued. By 1170, at the end of the Third Crusade, and after the Third Crusade, the Christians had lost all the territory east of the Orontes. They took back Ascalon in 1153 and launched a campaign to capture Egypt in the 1160s. And now the focus of the Crusades becomes different. They laid siege to Alexandria, Damietta, and 3 times to Bilbais. And this is essentially, I like this map better. I don't know if you can see it better or not, but it has all the names on it. The question is, can we read them? Okay, but here is where the attacks were launched from, at Ascalon, which is right here, just south of Jerusalem and on the coast. This was the launching site of all the Crusades from that time forward, and they went against these places here, Bilbao and Damietta, which they actually captured several times, and Alexandria. And so those were the points of attack. Now they were fighting, interestingly, against the Fatimid kingdom of Egypt, which was the Caliphate of Cairo was an entirely different group of Muslims. They were the old Fatimid kingdom that dates all the way back to the death of Muhammad, whereas the kingdom of Zengi here and and the Sultanate of Iconium up here, these were Turkish. So the Middle East had been split for the time being. The Emirate of Damascus was also in the hands of the Turks. The Christians were unable to prevent the unification of the Muslims in 1169, and the castles were largely defensive, and they assumed great military importance now in defending the land. But Islam was now reunified, and this really spells the beginning of the end of the Crusader states. And what is the date we're talking about? 1169? I mean, they're not even 100 years old yet. And the Muslims are rallying, and they're eventually going to push them all the way out. The Muslim world had been transformed by the arrival of the Crusaders. In the 12th century, a series of strong leaders forged a united empire from the Islamic states of the Near East. The Seljuks had radically altered the political configuration of the Near East, as we saw in the 11th century, breaking it up into individual groups. Now it's going to reunify, and not necessarily under Turks. But the great Seljuk Empire was now long past its peak. Only the branch at Mosul was able to offer effective resistance to the Crusaders. And it was from Mosul that we see the rise of the new leaders of the Muslim world. It was governed by the Atabeg Imad al-Din Zengi, who is a great hero who starts the reconquest of the Holy Land. And Matthew was asking me what an Atabeg is. I put regent here. He's kind of a regent. He usually the term Atabeg was used to designate someone who rules while a young child was in his minority and needed to rise up to, grow up to his majority. But sometimes they would appoint an Atabeg as a kind of viceroy to the Sultan. Okay, and we were talking about this in the graduate seminar the other night, the fact that the Muslim government doesn't seem very elaborate. It's not as well defined as the Frankish government was, which had levels, and it had courts, and it had institutions, and I'm not finding that really in the Muslim kind of government. It's very simplistic and very autocratic. That usually there are just a couple of leaders who have all the powers until we come to the Mamluks. And then when we come to the Mamluks, they start building a very sophisticated bureaucratic government. But until then, you don't have that kind of an organization. It's just strictly autocratic. Okay, so Zengi is the leader who begins the reconquest of the Holy Land. Here is the Crac de Chevalier, which is the most famous of the Crusader castles, and here you can see it's typical of a 12th century castle. It's one of the best ones that survives in the Holy Land. And here is a map that shows us where Mosul was. The leader of Mosul is essentially Mesopotamia, and this area right in here between the Tigris-Euphrates rivers, the kingdom of Zengi, and extending to the Holy Land. And down here is a different caliphate of Baghdad. Okay, it's kind of far away, but they're aiming toward recapturing the Holy Land. And really the Crusader states are quite small in comparison to the amount of land that the Muslims hold. I mean, the Christian states are a very small percentage of that area of land, which is surprising that the Christian conquest of that coastline had such a huge impact on the Muslim world. Well, Zengi occupied Aleppo in 1128 after his appointment as Atabeg in 1127, and then he captured Edessa in 1144, which was a great turning point, of course, because that led to the Second Crusade. It fostered. Here's a description of the fall of Edessa that's kind of interesting. Okay, let me see what that source is to tell you what that is. Footnotes should always be at the bottom of the page. I hate it when they're at the back. Okay. Okay. This is William of Tyre who describes the fall of Edessa. In that same year, during the time which elapsed between the death of King Baldwin's father and Baldwin, that would have been Baldwin the second, and Baldwin's elevation to the throne, one Zengi, a vicious man, was the most powerful of the eastern Turks. His city, formerly called Nineveh, but now known as Mosul, is the metropolis of the region which was earlier called Ashur. Zengi, its lord and governor at this time, laid siege to the city of Edessa, more commonly called Rojas, the greatest and most splendid city of the Medes. Zengi did this relying on the numbers and strength of his men, and also on the very dangerous strife which had arisen between Prince Raymond of Antioch and Count Jocelyn of Edessa. The city of Edessa lies beyond the Euphrates, one day's journey from the river. The aforesaid Count of Edessa, contrary to the custom of his predecessors, had ceased to live in the city and made his constant and perpetual abode in a place called Turbessel. He did this both because of the richness of the spot and because of his own laziness. Here, far from the tumult of the enemy and free to pursue his pleasure, the Count failed to take proper care of his noble city. The population of Edessa was made up of Chaldeans and Armenians, unwarlike men, scarcely familiar with the use of arms and accustomed only to the arts of trade. The city was only rarely visited by Latins, and very few of them lived there. The safekeeping of the city was entrusted solely to mercenaries, and these were not paid according to the type of service they performed or the length of time for which they were engaged. Indeed, they often had to wait a year or more for the payment of their stated wages. Both Baldwin and the elder Jocelyn, when they held the county, made their home permanently and customarily in Edessa, and took care to have the city supplied with food, arms, and other necessary items from nearby places. They had thus been able to both maintain themselves in safety and also to overawe the neighboring towns with their strength. There was, as we have said before, bad feeling between Count Jocelyn and the Prince of Antioch, a feeling that was not hidden, but rather had become an open hatred. For this reason, each of them took little or no care if the other were attacked or suffered misfortune. Rather, they rejoiced at the other's catastrophes and were made glad by the other's mishaps. The aforesaid great Prince Zengi took the opportunity offered by this situation. He gathered innumerable cavalry forces throughout all of the east. He even called up the people of the city surrounding Edessa and brought them with him to lay siege to the city. He blockaded all of the entrances to the city so that the besieged citizens could not get out, and so that those who wished to help them could not get in. The resulting shortage of food and provisions caused great suffering for the besieged. The city, however, was surrounded by a formidable wall. In the upper town there were high towers, and down below there was the lower town where the citizens could take refuge, even if the city itself were taken. All these defenses could be of use against the enemy only if there were men willing to fight for their freedom, men who would resist the foe valiantly. The defenses would be useless, however, if there were none among the besieged who were willing to serve as defenders. Towers, walls, and earthworks are of little value to a city unless there are defenders to man them there. Zengi found the town bereft of defenders and was much encouraged. He encircled the town with his forces, assigned the officers of his legions to appropriate stations, and dug in. The catapults and siege engines weakened the fortifications. The continual shooting of arrows tormented the citizens incessantly, and the besieged were given no respite. It was announced, meanwhile, and the news was also spread by rumor, that the city of Edessa, a city faithful to God, was suffering the agonies of a siege at the hands of the enemy of the faith and the foe of the Christian name. At this news, the hearts of the faithful far and wide were touched, and zealous men began to take up arms and harass the wicked. Okay, but the gist of it is the city fell to Zengi because he was a superior leader and general, and the Franks were not united, for one thing. They were struggling among each other, and they didn't help each other defend the city. So Zengi, with the fall of Edessa, we have the beginning of the end of the Crusader states. They lasted until 1291, but it's all downhill from that point forward. Okay, he captured Edessa in 1144, which was an event of huge momentum and really raised the morale in the Muslim world. But interestingly, he was assassinated in 1146. So the Muslims also had their troubles among their leaders who couldn't cooperate. He had a son, however, Nur al-Din, and he became the next hero of the Muslim reconquista of the Holy Land. Nur al-Din took Damascus in 1154, and he was acclaimed king of Damascus by the Caliph in Baghdad. His next objective was to take Egypt, which had long been isolated under the Fatimid dynasty of the Shiites, and of course the Turks in that area were Sunnis. Nur al-Din then gained control of Egypt, but it is one of his generals who was the next Muslim hero to rise to the fore in the reconquest of the Holy Land. This was Saladin, one of his generals who was appointed to administer Egypt. In 1171, the Fatimids were deposed and Sunni Islam was reinstated. But in 1174, Nur al-Din dies, and that's the end of his line, and then Saladin, a Kurd from northern Iraq, was disputed as his successor, but Saladin was a man of tremendous administrative and military and political talents, and he triumphed in the end and took over Fatimid Egypt, and from that point he just expanded in every direction. Okay, do you all know who the Kurds are? You know about the Kurds in Iraq right now, in northern Iraq, who are not of the same ethnic groups as the Mesopotamians. Actually, the Mesopotamians in that valley. See if we can go back to our map. They live in this area in the north, and they're an Indo-European group of peoples, and they're ethnically and linguistically different from the people who live in the southern part, who are of a stock of Mesopotamia dating back thousands of years, really. But the Kurds are Indo-Europeans related to the Afghan people. And so Saladin was a Kurd. That always interests me. I think it's quite surprising. Here's one of those romantic pictures of Saladin, again a 19th century depiction of Saladin, which is very romantic, showing him as a great warrior slaying everybody around. Saladin used his Egyptian power base to gain control of Syria from the Zengids, the followers of Zengi, and in 1174 he took Damascus away from the Zengi's followers, and in 1183 he took Aleppo. In 1185 he took Myafarakin and nominal overlordship of Mosul. Mosul is the northern kingdom in the Mesopotamian River Valley. Meanwhile, the Seljuks of Rome had crushed the Byzantines at Kephalon, and so the Byzantines lost their hold on the areas they had reconquered in Asia Minor, and now the Crusader states were encircled by a united Muslim power. In 1187, Saladin crossed the River Jordan on 30 June with an army of about 30,000, including 12,000 regular cavalry, and so that's a huge army. Here we can see the conquests starting from Egypt and the movement of Zengi, first out to the Emirate of Damascus and then the kingdom of Zengi. So he has this huge area of land here. And then with the revival of Rome and the reconquest of the Byzantine areas, we have this group in the north, the Sultanate of Rome, and the Crusader states are surrounded. They're left sort of high and dry. And this is really, this map shows the reconquest that Saladin is going to make in the on the next page, that he is crossing the Orontes River and going in and reconquering Jerusalem and the kingdom, starting at Tiberias. This is where he attacks first, at Tiberias, and from there he launches his attack. The Christian army was commanded by Guy of Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, and the army that Guy pulled together was the largest ever raised, but this was only 20,000 men and 1,200 knights, but it was the largest Christian army that had ever been raised in the Holy Land. They assembled at Sephori, where there was a good water supply, but Saladin lured the Christian army away from their camp by sending a section of his army to attack Tiberias. The Muslims swiftly overran the town and began a siege of its castle. The Christian leaders decided to advance to the relief of Tiberias, but they were harassed by Muslim archers and skirmishers. And I think Matthew was asking me if I was going to discuss any of the military tactics and the organization of the Muslim army. If I can remember correctly, they first would send in the archers, and the archers would fight on horseback, which is an unfamiliar tactic to the Europeans, because the Europeans always fought. European archers always were foot soldiers. But these archers rode fast ponies that would gallop in, and they had much smaller bows than the Europeans, and so they would shoot, they would just rain arrows on them, and then behind them would become the heavily armed cataphracts who would then cut everybody down with their swords. They'd sort of soften them up with the archers, and that's their main battle tactic. So they were harassed by the Muslim archers and skirmishers, and the Christians made slow progress toward Tiberias. Soon they began to suffer from thirst and heat exhaustion, and on July 3rd they camped near Messina. Okay, and here is, again, a portrait of Guy of Lusignan, and I blew it up a lot larger this time so you can see Guy a little better. Maybe he has some character here. And this looks like the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, doesn't it? Isn't that amazing that that's what he would put on that coin? Can you read that? It says Jerusalem around here. Rex King Guido. Guy. Okay. And here is Tiberias. The city of Tiberias is right there, and this is where this attack is taking place. Okay. The Crusaders decided to strike north in search of water, but their line of march was dangerously extended. The Muslims were on the heights known as Carn Hattin, the horns of Hattin. And here's the Muslim description of the Battle of Hattin, which was a huge battle and a really great turning point in the war between the Muslims and the Crusaders. Here's a description by Saladin's son, Al-Afdal Ali. Then the Muslims returned to the attack against the Franks, and they went back up the hill. When I saw them retreating with the Muslims in pursuit, I cried out in joy, "We have beaten them." My father turned to me and said, "Be silent, we shall not defeat them until that red tent of the king falls." And as he spoke, the tent fell. And so the Battle of Hattin was this huge victory, which was celebrated gloriously in the Muslim world, and it was a sense of great shame and defeat by the Christians. It was a terrible shock to them that they were defeated in this great battle. You know, it's a kind of different thing. When the Christians attacked Damascus and they were repelled and defeated, that's one thing. I mean, they were on the attack there, but when they're attacked by the Muslims in their own homeland, this is a much greater defeat. So the Battle of Hattin marks a great turning point. and they were just slaughtered. They were either taken prisoner, and in fact Guy was taken prisoner by Saladin at the Battle of Hattin, along with a whole bunch of other knights and Knights Templar. A lot of the Knights Templar were defending, and Saladin just slaughtered them. He hated the Knights Templar, and he just massacred them. But there were massacres on both sides. I mean, as you know from reading the story of this battle. So only a small body of knights under Raymond of Tripoli escaped by charging through Taqi al-Din's line to the northeast, and Guy and the rest surrendered to Saladin. The army of Jerusalem had been destroyed. It had either been killed or captured, and this was the greatest army they had ever put together. What a blow to their morale. Saladin's troops then fanned out through Galilee and Samaria and easily took Nazareth and other lightly defended places. Saladin advanced toward Acre and other coastal harbor castles to the north. Deprived of their garrisons by King Guy, in order to make that army so big, he sort of mined all of the men from all of those cities, and so now all the coastal cities were just easy prey to Saladin. Saladin decided that Tyre was too well defended. Who was in charge of Tyre? Anybody remember? Who was in charge of Tyre? Somebody different from the Crusaders.
The Venetians.
The Venetians, right. The Venetians were too smart to send their people to Guy's army. They didn't send Guy their soldiers, and so they defended their own city, and so Saladin couldn't conquer Tyre. And also, without a fleet, he couldn't starve out Tyre because the Venetians were supplying it by ship. It couldn't be besieged. It couldn't be cut off and starved to death. So Tyre survived, and in fact, Tyre survives until the bitter end. So at that point, then, Saladin moved south against Ascalon, the launching site of the Crusader naval raids against Egypt, and he took Ascalon, and then he started besieging Jerusalem. After negotiating, the city surrendered on 2 October, and the capture of Jerusalem was a devastating blow to Christian morale, a propaganda victory for Saladin because he now had Jerusalem, but the Christians were just absolutely devastated. They couldn't believe that they had lost Jerusalem. At that point, they'd only had it. They had it less than 100 years, hadn't they? But Saladin could not keep such a large army in the field, so he marched north and took many more vulnerable castles. He avoided the cities of Tripoli and Antioch, which were too large and too strong, and in 1188 a second round of campaigning brought more gains. Tyre still seemed impregnable, and his failure to capture it was a major strategic error. But Saladin had taken over 50 Crusader castles, and as I said, they were so thickly placed all throughout the entire country that everywhere you turn there's a castle. And here we can see now the progress of Saladin going south here to Ascalon and going up the coast here, skipping Tyre and going up farther up the coast. So he is well on his way to conquering most of the Holy Land here. The Christians had lost nearly all the kingdom of Jerusalem, and by Saladin's death in 1193, he had taken most of Palestine. His brother then conquered Yemen, and one of his Mamluks invaded North Africa. His dynasty, the Ayyubids, would dominate the Near East for the next half century. And here I have, let's see. Here I have this table that shows the Ayyubite rulers that illustrates Saladin's lineage. Okay. These are generals. Okay, here is the father, and Shiraga and Ayyub are both generals in the army of the Atabegs in Mosul, and they have two sons, Saladin and Malik al-Adil, who then together make their career. And Malik has all of these sons who then take over the rulership of Egypt and the entire Middle East. And this is a dynasty that lasts for 3 generations, as you can see, until it's finally deposed by the Mamluks. Okay. The Christians had lost nearly all the kingdom of Jerusalem. And by Saladin's death in 1193, he had taken most of Palestine. And as I said, I've got this down twice, his brother conquered Yemen, and one of his Mamluks invaded North Africa. And the Ayyubids would dominate the Near East for the next half century. Okay, skip this one. Now, the Third Crusade was a direct result of the fall of Jerusalem. Up to this point, and including the Third Crusade, all of the crusades so far, the major crusades that have names, have been a result of some disaster in the Holy Land. Okay, the First Crusade was called because of the Battle of Manzikert and the loss of Asia Minor, and the Byzantines asked for help. The Second Crusade was called in response to the fall of Edessa, so they had to come and save Edessa. The Third Crusade was in response to the fall of Jerusalem. Okay. But after that, the Crusades are going to be different. Okay. Now let's see what happened in the Third Crusade. Saladin's onslaught was countered by the Third Crusade, and they succeeded in the Third Crusade in recapturing most of the coastal plain of Palestine. But it was very hard, and they wouldn't have done it if they hadn't had that great hero, Richard Lionheart, to lead them to victory. The news of the crushing defeat at Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem on 2 October 1187 provoked a massive reaction in the West, and in fact, Pope Urban III died of shock at the news. Okay, he was just so devastated. And it also caused the calling of the Third Crusade, in which Richard Lionheart was the hero of the West. The crusade was called by Urban III's successor, Gregory VIII, by his papal bull called Audita Tremendae. It has been heard with, I'm not sure whether that's with trembling or with the tremendous news. I have to look that up. Okay, issued 29 October. In November, Richard of Poitou, who later would become Richard, King of England, was the first to take the cross when the crusade was called by Pope Gregory. He was followed by Henry II of England and Philip Augustus II of France. These are kings. King Henry II was Richard's father, and he followed Richard to answer the call to the Third Crusade. King Philip Augustus of France, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, and King William II of Sicily. William II of Sicily immediately sent his fleet, and he saved Tripoli, Antioch, and Tyre, and so he was the first to sort of make a mark in the Third Crusade. But the death of Henry II delayed the departure of Richard Lionheart and Philip Augustus until 1190. Fleets from northern Europe, Flanders, and England left in May 1189. They stopped on the way to harass in Spain, where they captured slaves from the Moors en route. A Pisan fleet reached Palestine in the summer of 1189. Okay, we're going to take a look at some of these actors here. Here is the seal of Richard Lionheart, in French, Richard Coeur de Lion. And setting off on, this is his royal seal as king. He's shown as a warrior, of course. And here is the seal of Henry II, his father, King of England, who pledged to go on the crusade. And here is the seal of Philip Augustus. And interestingly, he's not showing himself as a warrior. He's showing himself as a ruler seated on the throne with the fleur-de-lis of France and the royal scepter in his hand. And this is a fitting portrait because he didn't fight very much on the crusade. Okay, and I couldn't find a picture of Frederick Barbarossa that was out of copyright, so I have this this dreadful 19th century drawing of Barbarossa at the National Fete of Mayence. But here he is. But it's interesting, as here is the royal insignia, the heraldic image of the empire, and it's shown on these, instead of crusader crosses, it's shown on the shields and the backs, the clothing of these people. And this is supposedly Frederick Barbarossa. I don't think he really looked like that, though. But it sort of, evokes the image. Okay, and here are the cities that William II of Sicily, who I also didn't have a picture of, even a modern one, and here are the cities that he saved from the Muslims by sending his fleet. And Sicily, of course, had a wonderful fleet. In May 1189, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa left Regensburg at the head of a massive army. But the situation in Syria remained desperate. The remaining settlers were divided in allegiance between Guy of Lusignan and Conrad of Montferrat, who had saved Tyre from Saladin in 1187. Guy began to besiege Acre in August 1188 with a tiny force, and fleets from Europe headed to Acre for help. These included the forces from Cologne in 1189, the forces of Henry of Champagne and Louis of Thuringia in 1190, and the forces of Leopold of Austria in 1191. So it's almost a European-wide movement to try to save the Holy Land, to get everybody there that they can. And here is a picture that I thought looked rather German of these knights setting out to the Holy Land. This looks like a German castle in the background, but and this is a German shield. So here are the knights setting out on the Third Crusade. And here are the ships that have come to relieve the city. And this is interesting. We have one of these towers, one of these siege machines that on a ship that they're bombarding the castle with. A lot of these castles were built on islands, and so they had to be besieged by ship in just this kind of an attack, with a tower, a siege tower, and shooting arrows into the city. After a successful march across Central Europe and Asia Minor, Frederick's army fell apart because Frederick accidentally drowned in the river Goksu on 10 June in 1190 in Hungary on the way to the crusade. He fell in the river and drowned, and so that was pretty much the end of the German crusade, because meager remnants of his force reached Acre in October. In July 1190, Richard and Philip Augustus of France set out together from Vézelay, the very place where the Second Crusade had been preached. Richard sent an advance guard under Baldwin, Archbishop of Canterbury, to Acre. It's interesting that the Archbishop of Canterbury is going on crusade and fighting battles. Actually, he's leading the army as an advanced guard. While the king spent the winter in Sicily, and what they did was mostly fight with each other and argue and sort of verbally joust with each other and try to undermine the other, each try to undermine the other. Philip sailed directly to, what's interesting, another thing I have to mention about Sicily with Richard and Baldwin in Sicily, Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, went to Sicily, and she visited him there, and she brought him his future bride, who was a princess from Spain. And she arranged the wedding so that I think they were married in Sicily. But then the two women also went on this crusade. Eleanor was quite fond of crusading, apparently, but she was about 80 years old at this point. And I think I can't remember what his bride's name was, but the two of them together accompanied Richard, and then Eleanor eventually went back as regent of the kingdom, while Richard and his wife went on to the Holy Land. Well, the king spent the winter in Sicily. Philip sailed directly to Acre in March 1191, but Richard turned to wrest Cyprus from the Byzantines. It had been ruled by Isaac Comnenus, a brother or a cousin of Manuel Comnenus, the emperor, and so what Richard did was just take it from the Byzantines, and so set up another Crusader kingdom. And so now we can speak from this time forward of the Crusader kingdom of Cyprus. Okay, here's another romantic 19th century drawing of the death of Frederick Barbarossa as he falls in the river here on his horse. And there are all his soldiers on the shore. Nobody can save him. And here are some French crusaders going off to crusade, and we know they're crusaders because they're carrying the standard with the cross up here and over here. Okay, they leave from Vézelay, which is right here again on the border between France and Burgundy, and the place where the crusade was called, the Second Crusade was called. They actually went overland, and I think they went down here someplace, and as far as I can tell, they then went by ship the rest of the way. This is Philip Augustus. Okay, and here they go. No, they went this way. Wait a minute. Okay, Richard and Philip Augustus go this way. I think this is Philip Augustus when he went home. He went this way. Okay, here he is setting out for the Holy Land. Richard then goes to Cyprus where he conquers it. Philip Augustus goes on to not Ascalon, to Tyre. He goes to Tyre. Okay. On the 8th of June, Richard landed at Acre and would remain in Palestine for 16 months. Between them, the Third and German Crusaders recovered most of the coastal ports and ensured a lifeline to the west for the settlers. Acre fell to the Crusaders in July 1191, and at that point, Philip Augustus left for home. And remember from our lecture last time that they interfered, each backing a different king for the Holy Land, as they were for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They backed different sides. But then Philip left for home, and on 22 August, Richard set off southwards. For the whole of the march, his army was under constant attack from Saladin's forces, and Richard organized his horsemen in divisions with the main standard in their midst. And here is Richard, another romantic picture of Richard Lionheart with holding the standard in the midst of the battle himself. And here's a trumpeter calling everyone to battle. A very romantic picture. The outer line of defense was provided by half the infantry, and the other half marched with the baggage between the knights and the seashore. A fleet shadowed the army and kept it supplied. So Richard was a superb warrior and a very good organizer and a very good planner, because supplies had always been the weakness of the Crusader armies, hadn't they? That they weren't supplied very well. They always tried to live off the land, and he had a fleet sailing down the coast with their supplies, so that's one reason for his success. After passing through the forest of Arsur, the army rested for 2 days at the river Rosh Taye. Then they emerged on the plain north of Arsur. Saladin redoubled his efforts, and on 7 September the Christians were under heavy attack from light cavalry shooting arrows, and many Christian horses were killed. By the way, they all brought their horses with them, as all the Crusaders did. Their horses were specially trained for battle, so they brought the horses with them on their ships. Richard prepared an enveloping assault, but only a frontal charge was launched, and after a shaky counterattack, the Muslims were driven from the field. Richard then reached Jaffa on 10 September and spent the next year in southern Palestine. He twice advanced to within a few miles of Jerusalem in December 1091 and June of 1092, and he began to rebuild Ascalon to secure the southern approaches to a restored kingdom of Jerusalem. He spectacularly thwarted Saladin's attempt to recapture Jaffa in August 1192, and this resulted in a treaty on 12 September. The terms of the treaty were that the defenses of Ascalon were to be demolished. The Christians were to retain control of the coast between Acre and Jaffa, and the Christians were to be allowed to visit the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. On 9 October, with the truce completed and a sort of reconquest of a part of the Holy Land, Richard then sailed for home. Okay. Within 3 years, Frederick Barbarossa's son, Henry VI, organized another crusade. Although Henry died before the departure, a substantial German army reached Palestine, and in September 1197 occupied Sidon and Beirut. The army disintegrated when the news of the emperor's death reached it. And this is kind of the end. This is kind of a postscript to the Third Crusade. But does the Third Crusade mark a turning point in crusading? Well, there are some ways in which it does, and this all feeds into some other questions about interpreting the Crusades and how we understand the Crusades. Before the Third Crusade, no one thought they were permanent. They thought there was just going to be one crusade, and that would be it, and they would never have to go again. But here we've had all these little crusades going on then, and then the big Second Crusade, and then the big Third Crusade, and suddenly people are aware crusades are here to stay, that crusades are going to be part of life. And by the Third Crusade, they had gone through the motions that they had to do of all the preparing for the crusades enough time so that now everything was regularized. It had become custom or tradition because they had repeated doing it 3 times, and they had gone through the same sorts of rituals, the same sorts of preparations, and all of a sudden it had become custom. Okay, crusades are going to be permanent. It's patternized, it's regularized. And so now we know the drill. We know what to do when there's a crusade. And so it's like a permanent fixture after the Third Crusade. The rituals are set in place, the routines are adhered to. Popes and kings also were beginning to recognize the potential of the crusading movement, the usefulness to politics and political goals. And we might ask the question, why Philip Augustus even went on crusade? Okay, all he did was journey to the Holy Land, fiddle around in the politics for a while, turn around and go home. So why did he go on the crusade? Clearly, for the prestige, the political prestige that he would get at home. Philip Augustus was a king who is famous not for the crusade on which he did nothing, but he's famous for reorganizing France and re-establishing the French kingdom. I've been showing you that map where you saw just the little bitty part of France was there. And I'll show you another map in a few moments where you can see just this kingdom of France is a tiny part of the northern part, and all the rest is independent. Well, what Philip Augustus did was to start the reunification of France, to start the pulling together of all the counties and duchies that were equal to the King of France, pulling them under his control. And one of the first things he did was conquer Normandy. So all he did was go put in an appearance on the crusade and turn around and go right back home, because France was far more important to him than the crusade. Okay, so popes and kings were beginning to recognize the potential of the crusading movement and the usefulness to politics and political goals. And not only the kings. I think Richard Lionheart might have been sincere in his going on crusade and wanting to be a crusader, but he may be the last one who was a sincere crusader. Okay, did I skip another page? Oh, I skipped page 18. Okay. Yeah.
They began to recognize that the usefulness of the crusade for political reasons. Well, didn't Urban II knew that when he started the first crusade?
Well, I think thanks, Jody. I think he had an inkling. He had a guess that might be true, but he wasn't. But nobody had ever done it before, so he didn't know what would happen. It was a great gamble. I mean, I think he had some political goals in mind, but he had no idea how it would work out. Now the popes are much more sophisticated, and they have a feeling for how they can control things, and they can manipulate the events. Okay. Thank you, Joni. Okay, now what I have missing here is Innocent III and the height of the crusading movement. I said the Third Crusade represents a turning point, and it seems to, because after the Third Crusade, and one of the points I made was that each of the first three crusades that we name were in response to a disaster in the Holy Land. After that, they're not. After that, they just call them and call them and call them. And it's not because they're generated by a disaster like the fall of Jerusalem. They just call them whenever they want to, whenever it's convenient. So that's one thing that changes. And the question is, why? Is it because people realize that the Crusades are going to be permanent, or is it because of a person? Is it because of the crusading movement, or is it because of Innocent III, who then is the next pope? Innocent III marks the height of the crusading movement, and Innocent marks a turning point also, Pope Innocent III. One of the things that Innocent III did was call a whole bunch of crusades. He didn't just call one or none like the previous popes, but he called 5 or 6 crusades. And in Innocent III's crusades, he deliberately tried to exclude the kings. Okay, he tried to put them in the hands of major counts or churchmen whenever he could, and he tried to keep the king's fingers out of it because he wanted them to be papal movements and to benefit the papacy. Okay, so the potential that Urban saw, to answer your question, the potential that Urban saw, Innocent saw too, but he saw how to use it, and he did use it that way. What are the crusades that Urban called? He called the Fourth Crusade, and the ones who responded were the Venetians, Count Thibaud of Champagne, Louis of Blois, Simon de Montfort, Reynald of Montferrat, Baldwin of Flanders, Boniface of Montferrat, Enrico Dandolo, Alexius Angelus, and the brother-in-law of Philip of Swabia. Okay, these, no kings. He doesn't want any kings on the Crusades. These are all noblemen of a lesser rank than a king. Okay, Innocent also taxes the church for the first time, and he regularizes the Crusader taxes so that he taxes everyone. It's like an income tax for the crusade to pay for all the crusades. And this is the first time anybody's done that. You know, sure, local taxes that were levied from time to time, but this is a bureaucratic tax. I mean, a universal income tax. And of course, in the Fourth Crusade, we have the conquest of Zara and Constantinople, which we'll talk about later. Baldwin of Flanders was elected emperor of Constantinople. Boniface of Montferrat was then betrothed to Margaret of Hungary and became part of the aristocracy. In addition to the Fourth Crusade, Innocent called the Livonian Crusade in the Baltic, and the responders were also noblemen, not kings. Albert of Buxtehude, and during that the Livonian Crusade in the Baltic, Our Lady of Riga was set up in Livonia, and Livonia was then labeled and characterized as the dowry of the Virgin. So it became another holy crusade to restore the dowry of the Virgin. They gave it a religious context in the north that it didn't have before. The Sword Brothers were one of the brotherhoods, like the Templars and the Hospitallers, who became a brotherhood, a military brotherhood. The Danes attacked Estonia, Finland, Saaremaa, and Prussia, and King Valdemar II of Denmark got involved, and also Russian Novgorod. And from this point forward, we have a perpetual crusade in the Baltic. And here again, we can see these Baltic lands stretching all the way to Novgorod. The Russians, of course, are separate from Byzantium because they have their own Orthodox Church. I mean, they follow the Orthodox religion, but it is a Russian Orthodox. They split from the Church. When they converted, they did not put themselves under the Byzantines, but maintained their independence with their own language. And so they become involved in this crusade because it's in there, right next to where they are. And so again, these are the territories, and of course the Danes are getting involved, and we see all of these. A permanent crusade going on. Innocent also called a crusade against Marquard of Anweiler, who he labels as another Saladin. But Marquard was the power behind the throne in Sicily, and he was trying to rally the Italian and Sicilian barons on behalf of Conrad as the heir to the throne. Conrad was the son of Frederick II, if you remember. And so Marquard of Anweiler was rallying the forces against the papal candidate for Emperor of Germany. And so this is a crusade in Italy, right next door to the papacy. He also called the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, where the Cathars and the Neo-Manichees were heretics, and so he called a crusade against them. Also, the Waldensians were all these heretics. He called crusades against them. This then stimulated the preaching mission of Diego of Osma and Saint Dominic, preaching against the Count Raymond the Sixth of Toulouse and Raymond Roger of Tronqueval, Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne. Simon de Montfort actually fought on the royal side, and Peter II of Aragon changed sides back and forth in that crusade. We'll look at that crusade in some detail. In Spain, the victory at Las Navas de Tolosa then freed up people in Barcelona to make incursions into Languedoc. And in 1226, King Louis VIII of France and Humbert of Beaujeu and Louis's brother Alphonse of Poitiers got involved in the conquest, not the reconquest, but the conquest of southern France, which was really separate from northern France. It was almost a separate culture. It was so different. And in fact, the Albigensian Crusade meant the conquest of southern France by northern France. And here we can see where the war against the crusade against Marquard of Anya, Marquard of what's his name again? All right, in the south of Italy was taking place. That war, a crusade here, and in fact, remember when we talked about Frederick II, he was on crusade at that time in the Holy Land, and he had to rush home to take care of this war. Okay, so here the war was for the German Empire and for the South because the inheritance surrounded the papacy. So of course the papacy wanted to have some control over who was going to be the heir. Now, this is the Kingdom of France, and as Philip Augustus reconstructed it, he brought Normandy, Flanders, and Brittany under his control, and the Duchy of Burgundy. But now, so that was included the whole Kingdom of France in the northern part, and when Innocent III called the Albigensian Crusade, he in effect invited Philip Augustus and his son to conquer southern France, because they were quite separate, and they had a separate culture altogether from northern France. The Spanish Crusade, he also called a Spanish Crusade. Can anybody add up how many crusades he's called at this point? He calls 5 or 6 crusades, which is phenomenal. No other pope has done that before. He calls the Spanish Crusade and Bishop Geoffrey of Nantes, Alfonso of Castile, and Peter of Aragon, Archbishop Arnold of Narbonne, and King Sancho VII of Navarre take part in that. And during this crusade, the victory at Las Navas de Tolosa was a great turning point in the Reconquista. From that point forward, the Crusaders would reconquer Spain. It was absolutely certain at that point. Another crusade, he didn't actually call this, but the crusade that rose up was the Children's Crusade, led by Nicholas, a boy of Cologne, and Stephen, a French shepherd boy. And what the Children's Crusade demonstrates is that there was just an incredible feeling for the crusade and an incredible energy by everyone, a devotion to the spiritual cause of the crusade. I mean, it's really quite astounding that these children could be inspired to just, set off for the Holy Land. They ended up all being sold into slavery. Is that what you wanted to ask? Yeah, they ended up all being sold into slavery. Okay, here is again the reconquest of Spain with the Battle of Tolosa. And here is a fanciful drawing of the Children's Crusade with them all setting off to their disaster at the end, where they either die or they're sold into slavery. Innocent III then preached the Fifth Crusade, another crusade. Anybody count them up? How many does that make? That'd be the sixth that he calls. I mean, no other pope even dreamed of calling 6 crusades. He preached the Fifth Crusade, and with the papal bull Quia Major, taxing the church again in a very regularized way. And during the Fifth Crusade in England, France, and Germany, there appeared handbooks for preachers to preach the crusade. So now it had become even more institutionalized and bureaucratized and formalized, so that I mean, they have all of this machinery to perpetuate the crusades. Papal legates were preaching the crusade in Scandinavia and France, and at the Fourth Lateran Council in 11 November 1215, Innocent issued the bull Ad Liberandam, the most extensive and ambitious catalog of Crusader rights and privileges. And it was really Innocent III who established the indulgence as the major spiritual reward for the Crusades. Earlier, that had been relatively minor. Now he sets it up as a major goal for the Crusaders. But in July 1216, Innocent died, and he was succeeded by Honorius III. Nevertheless, the Fifth Crusade went on, led by King Andrew of Hungary, Leopold of Austria, and also by our old friend John of Brienne, who was now, remember last time we left him, he was fighting in Sicily at 80 years old. Now he was almost 90, going on the Fifth Crusade, which is quite amazing. John of Brienne, okay. They briefly captured Damietta. By now the Crusader states were shrunken to a few coastal enclaves, and here we can see the Crusader states, and as nearly as I could piece them together, the pink parts are the parts that they were reduced to. The orange parts are the parts that Richard Lionheart actually added. So, but they're still, just hugging the coast there. Okay. The Crusade of Frederick II took place after he had been excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX, and he didn't even fight any battles. He just exchanged embassies with Melik al-Kamil, the Sultan of Egypt, and actually gained Bethlehem and Nazareth and Sidon, the castle of Tibnine, and Jerusalem by a treaty. Okay, no more battles, just win by a treaty. Now, Jonathan Riley Smith puts forth the concept of Innocent III and the height of the crusading movement. Okay, to me, I don't know if I would call it the height of the crusading movement, but that's what he calls it. He divides the Crusades into periods. He calls it a crusading movement, first of all. He doesn't talk about the Crusades. He calls it a crusading movement, which means the institutionalizing of the Crusades within Europe. He conceives the Crusades very broadly as encompassing all movements that are called holy war, including against the Wends, against the Moors in Spain, even against political enemies within Europe itself, against heretics like the Albigensians in southern France. And he conceives the Crusades as having a youth, an adolescence, a height, a maturity, and an old age. The First Crusade is a birth and a youth. The 12th century, which would have the Second and Third Crusades, would be adolescence, and the Third, Fourth, and Albigensian, and all those other crusades called by Innocent III, he calls the height. And then afterwards, two crusades by St. Louis, the Baltic, Spanish, and political crusades, he calls the maturity. And after the Reformation, he calls it the old age and death, from 1523, lasting all the way to 1798. Okay, so my question is, does all this make sense to you? Does it work? What do you think of Jonathan Riley Smith's concepts here in light of what you read and thought about so far? And we'll come back to them again later, but what do you think so far? Yeah, Steve.
Well, it seems that there are two things that he's really advocating. First of all, just progressive history. It's getting better along the way, but otherwise he's ignoring everything that didn't happen inside of Europe during the Crusades. He doesn't, when he's dealing with it in the idea of the maturity of one aging, he's not taking into consideration the outside factors that were playing on the Crusades, like the Crusader states, what was happening to them in their interactions with the Muslims and things like that. It just seems that it's very singular in its view, and it doesn't actually encompass very much about what was actually happening in the entirety of the Crusades.
The Crusader states are not very important in the scheme of things, are they? I mean, they're not very important. What do you think of that? Yeah.
Well, in terms of the Crusader states, it's rather ironic. I mean, seeing as how the Crusader states were an indirect result, and would logically seem to be a centerpiece in all of this. However, they played little or no role in any of the Crusades. But in terms of the logical validity of Riley Smith's interpretation, I'm able to see the logic in it. I mean, the First Crusade, it is its own creature. Mm-hmm. And second, the Crusades of the 12th century, that's leading up to and including the beginning of Innocent III's transformation of the idea of crusading. And then with each of the other ages of crusading, you can probably see a change in the ideology and or if not the location itself.
Yeah. But you don't see a change in the ideology. I mean, you don't, because what he's arguing is when Innocent III calls all those 5 or 6 crusades, however many they are, that it's institutionalized, that there's such a routine to it that everybody expects to go on crusade in their lifetime. I mean, that it just becomes a routine. What do you think about that?
But I think that when you change the role of crusades from saving the Holy Lands to fighting the Pope's enemy, mm-hmm. you're changing the ideology of it.
Okay. What good point.
Not only that, but also especially with the old age and death. Talking about especially the Crusades in the New World. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's for gold, God, and glory. And that's
he doesn't even, in his scheme, he doesn't mention the conquest of the New World. That's not part of his scheme, which surprised me. Okay. Why do you think he carries it up to 1798? I mean, for heaven's sakes, that is just amazing. Any idea why? You haven't read his book, so you don't know, but It's because the military orders, you know, like the Templars and the Knights of St. John, the Hospitallers, and exist on Malta until that late date. And so he considers the Crusades are not over until the last Templar dies and the last Knight of St. John is deposed. And I mean, he carries it off to the bitter end. I don't know if that works. I don't know. I feel like, you know, that's carrying it a little bit too far. But he kind of argues that the Reformation kills the Crusades in a way, and they linger on for those 250 years. That the Reformation changes the values of Europe so drastically because, you know, the Catholic Church is not the only European church anymore, and everybody's mind is on something other than crusade.